The explosion echoed across the Afghan mountains like thunder. But this time, it wasn't the enemy. This time, it was Sergeant Rebecca Scott's convoy that had hit the IED, marking the 7th unlucky incident in her 18-month deployment. As smoke billowed from the damaged Humvee and her squad scrambled for cover, Rebecca heard the familiar whispers that had followed her since basic training. There goes Jinx Scott again. What they didn't know was that in 72 hours, this same woman they blamed for every mishap would be the only thing standing between their entire forward operating base and complete annihilation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating base Sentinel, nestled in the unforgiving terrain of eastern Afghanistan's Kunar province. The base hummed with the controlled chaos that defined military life in a combat zone. The distant rumble of generators, the rhythmic thump of helicopters, and the constant chatter of radio communications had kept 800 soldiers connected to the wider war effort. Sergeant Rebecca Scott shouldered her rifle and stepped out of the temporary medical tent where she'd spent the last hour getting her latest batch of cuts and bruises examined. The medic, a soft-spoken corpsman named Jenkins, had shaken his head while cleaning the gash on her forehead from yesterday's convoy incident. 7th time this month, Scott, he'd muttered, applying antiseptic with practiced efficiency. Maybe you should consider a desk job. Rebecca had said nothing, just as she'd said nothing when Staff Sergeant Martinez suggested she was a walking disaster magnet during the morning briefing. Just as she'd said nothing when Private First Class Johnson openly wondered if she was cursed or something while they cleaned their weapons the night before. The words had lost their sting through repetition, but they'd gained weight in other ways, accumulating like sediment until they threatened to bury her reputation entirely. She walked across the dusty compound, her boots crunching on the gravel that covered every surface of the base. Around her, soldiers moved with purpose, mechanics worked on armored vehicles, communications specialists tended to antenna arrays, and patrols prepared for their daily missions into the surrounding valleys. Everyone had a role, everyone belonged, except Rebecca, who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of professional purgatory. The nickname Jinx had started during basic training at Fort Moore, Georgia, when a training exercise had gone sideways due to equipment failure during her squad's turn. Never mind that the radio had been malfunctioning for weeks before Rebecca ever touched it. She was the one holding it when it finally died completely, leaving her squad unable to call for extraction. During a simulated mission, the drill sergeant's colorful commentary had cemented the association in everyone's minds. Wherever Rebecca Scott went, things broke down. The pattern had followed her through advanced individual training, where a perfectly maintained M249 squad automatic weapon had jammed during her qualification test. Then through her assignment to the 3rd Infantry Division, where her first convoy patrol had encountered an unusually aggressive pack of wild dogs that forced them to take a longer route back to base. Each incident was explainable, rational, within the normal range of military complications, but together, they formed a narrative that had taken on a life of its own. Now, 18 months into her deployment with the 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, Rebecca had become the unit's unofficial scapegoat. When equipment failed, when missions ran into unexpected complications, when Murphy's Law asserted itself with particular vigor, someone would inevitably look around and spot Rebecca Scott nearby, confirming their suspicions that bad luck followed her like smoke. The truth was more complex, but truth had little defense against a reputation that had crystallized into accepted fact. Rebecca was actually one of the most technically proficient soldiers in the battalion. She could field strip and reassemble any weapon system in their inventory blindfolded. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 5%. She'd completed additional training courses in explosive ordnance disposal, advanced communications, and tactical medical aid qualifications that should have marked her as a valuable asset rather than a liability. But in the military, perception often mattered more than reality, and the perception of Rebecca Scott was clear. She was unlucky, unreliable, and best avoided when important missions were on the line. The irony wasn't lost on her that many of the unlucky incidents attributed to her were actually the result of her keen observational skills and willingness to speak up about potential problems. She'd been the one to notice the unusual tire wear on the Humvee that later suffered a blowout. But since the blowout happened during her convoy, she got blamed for the delay. She'd reported suspicious activity in a sector that later turned out to be an enemy staging area. But when the subsequent patrol encountered resistance, somehow it became her fault for stirring up trouble. Rebecca made her way to the communications bunker, a reinforced concrete structure buried halfway underground and bristling with satellite dishes and radio antennas. This was where she'd been assigned for the past 3 months, ever since Captain Williams decided that her problematic luck made her unsuitable for regular patrol duties. Officially, she was part of the Signals Intelligence Team. Unofficially, she was being kept away from missions where her presence might complicate things. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with electronic hum and the blue glow of multiple computer screens. Staff Sergeant Chun looked up from a bank of monitoring equipment as she entered. "Scott, you're on intercept duty again. Station 7 needs someone with your language skills." Rebecca nodded and settled into the indicated workstation. She was fluent in Pashto and Dari, the primary languages of the region, skills that had taken her 3 years of intensive study to develop. It was one of the few areas where her abilities were undeniably valuable, where her reputation for bad luck couldn't diminish her contribution. She put on the heavy headphones and began scanning radio frequencies, listening for enemy communications that might reveal tactical intelligence. The work required intense concentration and cultural knowledge understanding, not just the words being spoken, but the context, the regional dialects, the coded references that insurgent groups used to mask their intentions. For the next 4 hours, Rebecca lost herself in the work. She translated fragments of conversations between Taliban commanders, identified new radio call signs, and slowly pieced together patterns of communication that suggested increased enemy activity in the northern valleys. It was meticulous, important work that directly contributed to the safety of American forces in the region. But when she submitted her daily intelligence summary to Staff Sergeant Chun, she could see the skepticism in his eyes as he reviewed her findings. "Increased chatter in Sector 7? Chun asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's the 3rd time this month you've reported unusual activity there." "The pattern is consistent," Rebecca replied calmly. "Multiple call signs referencing movement and timing. The language suggests coordination for a significant operation." Chun leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Scott, I've got to ask, are you sure you're not seeing patterns that aren't there? I mean, with your track record, ... The implication hung in the air between them. Even when Rebecca was doing exactly what she'd been trained to do, her reputation preceded her. Every analysis she provided was filtered through the assumption that she was somehow unreliable, that her judgment was compromised by whatever cosmic force seemed to follow her around. "I'm sure," she said simply, because there was nothing else she could say. The intelligence was solid, the patterns were real, and the threat was genuine. But convincing anyone else of that had become increasingly difficult as her reputation had solidified into accepted wisdom. As evening fell over the base, Rebecca walked the perimeter alone, a habit she'd developed to clear her head after long days in the communications bunker. The base was quieter now, with most of the day shift settling in for dinner and rest. Guard towers stood sentinel against the darkening sky, their searchlights beginning to probe the surrounding terrain. She thought about the conversation with Chun, about the pattern of dismissal that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. Tomorrow she would submit another intelligence report that would be received with skepticism. She would continue to monitor enemy communications while being treated as a liability by the same people who depended on her work. But tonight, something felt different. The enemy chatter she'd been tracking was increasing in both frequency and urgency. References to timing, to coordination, to something called the final push were becoming more common. Her instincts, honed by months of careful listening and analysis, told her that something significant was building. The problem was that her instincts had been discredited by 18 months of being labeled as unlucky. When the moment came, and she was increasingly certain it would come soon, would anyone listen to the soldier they called Jinx? Or would her reputation finally prove as dangerous as everyone believed her presence to be? As she completed her circuit of the perimeter and headed back to her quarters, Rebecca Scott couldn't know that she had less than 3 days before her predictions would be proven devastatingly accurate. She couldn't know that the intelligence she'd been gathering would soon become the difference between life and death for every person on the base. And she certainly couldn't know that the reputation that had made her invisible would soon become the only thing standing between her fellow soldiers and complete disaster. All she knew was that something was coming, and for once she hoped her luck, good or bad, would be enough to help her comrades survive what was heading their way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was broken only by the amber glow of security lights and the occasional sweep of searchlights from the guard towers. Rebecca had been awake since 0300 hours, not by choice, but because the enemy radio traffic had intensified to levels she'd never encountered before. Multiple networks were active simultaneously, using sophisticated coordination protocols that suggested a level of planning far beyond the typical insurgent attacks the base had weathered over the past year. She sat hunched over her monitoring equipment in the communications bunker, her notepad filled with timestamps, frequencies, and translated fragments that painted an increasingly alarming picture. The chatter wasn't random, it was orchestrated, with clear command structures and operational timelines that pointed to something massive in the works. Thunder 7 to Mountain Base, she heard through her headphones, the Pashto words crackling with static. The shepherds are moving their flocks to high ground. The storm arrives with tomorrow's sun. Rebecca's pen paused over her notepad. Shepherds and flocks were known Taliban code words for fighters and weapons. High ground in this context almost certainly referred to the ridgelines that surrounded the base. And tomorrow's sun, that was less than 12 hours away. She switched to another frequency and immediately caught another transmission. Eagle nest. Confirms the birds have returned to roost. All nests prepared for the morning hunt. Her heart rate quickened. This wasn't just increased chatter anymore. This was operational confirmation. Multiple cells were acknowledging ready status for what sounded like a coordinated dawn assault. She began documenting everything with methodical precision, building a comprehensive intelligence picture that would be impossible to dismiss. At 0530 hours, as the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, Rebecca compiled her findings into an urgent intelligence report. The document was 12 pages long, dense with intercepted communications, frequency analysis, and tactical assessments. She'd identified at least 7 active enemy networks, mapped their probable positions based on signal strength and direction, and documented a clear timeline pointing to an imminent, large-scale attack. She printed the report and hurried across the base to the Tactical Operations Center, the fortified nerve center where the base's senior leadership planned and coordinated all military activities. The Tonka was already bustling with the controlled activity of the morning shift change. Officers and NCOs huddled around computer terminals and radio sets. Lieutenant Colonel Parker, the base commander, was reviewing overnight patrol reports when Rebecca approached his desk. At 45, Parker was a career infantry officer with 3 previous deployments under his belt. He was respected by his troops for his tactical competence and fair leadership, but he was also known for his methodical approach to decision-making, an approach that didn't always accommodate urgent interruptions from junior personnel. "Sir," Rebecca said, standing at attention, "I have urgent intelligence regarding imminent enemy activity." Parker looked up from his reports, his expression shifting from mild interest to barely concealed irritation when he recognized who was addressing him. Rebecca's reputation had preceded her even to the senior leadership level. "Scott, isn't it?" he said, glancing at the nameplate on her uniform. "What kind of urgent intelligence?" Rebecca handed him the report. "Sir, I've documented extensive enemy communications indicating a coordinated attack planned for this morning. Multiple networks are active, using operational codes that suggest significant force concentration in the surrounding areas." Parker accepted the report, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he studied Rebecca with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to take her seriously. The pause stretched uncomfortably long. "Scott, you're the signals analyst who's been reporting increased chatter for the past several weeks. Correct?" "Yes, sir, but this is different. The pattern has shifted from general preparation to specific operational coordination. The timing references are explicit, and the scale is unprecedented." "How unprecedented?" Parker asked, finally opening the report and scanning the first page. "Based on the number of active networks and the sophistication of their coordination, I estimate we're looking at a force of 200 to 300 fighters, sir, possibly more." Parker's eyebrows rose. 2 to 300? "Scott, the largest attack this base has faced was maybe 50 fighters, and that was considered a significant engagement. You're talking about a force larger than our entire garrison." "Yes, sir. I understand how it sounds, but the intelligence is solid. They've been building toward this for weeks, possibly months. The communications I've intercepted suggest this is intended to be a decisive engagement." Major Williams, the base's intelligence officer, approached Parker's desk, drawn by the conversation. Williams was a sharp, analytical officer who'd been skeptical of Rebecca's reports from the beginning. "Colonel, may I review the sergeant's findings?" Williams asked, extending his hand for the report. Parker handed it over, and Williams began reading with the intense focus of someone trained to spot flaws in intelligence analysis. Rebecca waited, knowing that her professional credibility was about to be tested by one of the most qualified intelligence officers in the battalion. After several minutes, Williams looked up. "Scott, these intercepts, you're confident in your translations?" "Absolutely, sir. I've double-checked every phrase, cross-referenced the terminology with known Taliban communication patterns, and verified the context through multiple sources." "The problem," Williams said slowly, "is that intelligence of this magnitude would typically be corroborated by other collection assets. Satellite imagery, human intelligence, signals from higher headquarters. We're not seeing any of that." Rebecca felt her frustration building. "Sir, with respect, satellite coverage of this area is limited, and our human intelligence network has been compromised by recent security sweeps. Radio intercepts may be our only advance warning." "Or," Williams replied, his tone growing more skeptical, "these could be deception communications designed to make us think an attack is imminent, when the real enemy activity is elsewhere." Parker closed the report and handed it back to Rebecca. "Scott, I appreciate your diligence, but Major Williams raises a valid point. We can't base major defensive preparations on uncorroborated intelligence, especially when the scope of the threat seems disproportionate to previous enemy capabilities." "Sir, what if I'm right?" Rebecca asked, her voice carrying an edge of desperation she immediately regretted. What if 300 fighters hit this base and were not prepared? The question hung in the air like smoke. Parker's expression hardened slightly, not with anger, but with the weariness of a commander who'd been managing competing intelligence assessments and resource limitations for months. "And what if you're wrong?" he replied. "What if I divert half my garrison to defensive positions based on your analysis, and the real attack comes from a completely different direction? What if this is enemy deception, and they use our repositioning to exploit weaknesses elsewhere?" Rebecca had no good answer. Military decision-making was always a balance of risks, and her reputation for being associated with problems didn't strengthen her credibility in moments like this. Williams stepped closer to Parker. "Sir, I recommend we implement heightened security protocols without major troop repositioning. Increase perimeter patrols, alert status, and communication monitoring. If Sergeant Scott's intelligence is accurate, we'll detect the attack early enough to respond appropriately." It was a compromise solution, acknowledged the possibility of threat without committing to major defensive changes. Parker nodded approvingly. "Agreed. Scott, continue monitoring communications and report any changes immediately." Williams briefed the company commanders on elevated threat conditions, but maintained current patrol schedules and defensive positions. Rebecca felt a hollow sensation in her chest. She'd presented her most comprehensive intelligence analysis ever, documented clear evidence of an imminent massive attack, and the result was essentially business as usual with slightly increased vigilance. Her reputation for bad luck had become a filter that diminished even her most professional work. As she left the TOC, Rebecca encountered Sergeant First Class Anderson, a seasoned NCO who supervised many of the base's security operations. Anderson had always been cordial to her, neither embracing nor rejecting the rumors about her supposed Jinx status. "Scott, heard you brief the old man on some heavy enemy activity," Anderson said, falling into step beside her. "Something like that," Rebecca replied, unwilling to elaborate on her frustration with the leadership's response. "For what it's worth," Anderson said quietly, "I've noticed some unusual activity in the perimeter sectors over the past few days. Nothing dramatic, but small signs that something might be building." Rebecca stopped walking. "What kind of signs?" "Unusual bird patterns, changes in local vehicle traffic, subtle shifts in how the civilian population around the base is behaving. Individually, they're meaningless. Together, they suggest the locals know something we don't." It was exactly the kind of corroborating evidence that Williams had said was missing from her intelligence analysis. "Have you reported this?" Anderson shrugged. "I mentioned it to my chain of command, but it's not the kind of hard intelligence that generates action. Just feelings and observations from an old sergeant who spent too much time in country." Rebecca realized that she wasn't the only one whose concerns were being filtered through assumptions and bureaucratic caution. Anderson's field experience was being dismissed just as her technical analysis had been, and the combination of their observations painted an even more alarming picture than either could provide alone. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "what would you do if you knew for certain that a major attack was coming in the next few hours?" Anderson studied her face, seeming to weigh her question against everything he'd heard about her reputation. Finally, he answered with the blunt honesty of a career soldier. "I'd make sure my gear was ready, my ammunition was distributed, and my soldiers knew where to find me when the shooting started. Because if you're right about this, Scott, it's going to be the kind of fight that sorts out who really knows their job from who's just pretending." As Rebecca walked back to the communications bunker, Anderson's words echoed in her mind. In a few hours, one way or another, her analysis would be proven right or wrong. But more than her professional credibility was at stake now if her intelligence was accurate. The lives of everyone on the base hung in the balance. She had done everything she could through official channels. Now, As the sun climbed higher over the Afghan mountains and enemy fighters presumably moved into their final assault positions, Rebecca Scott faced the most important question of her military career. When the attack came, would her reputation for bad luck finally prove prophetic, or would it be the very thing that saved them all? The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the base's main generator facility at precisely 0647 hours, just as the morning shift was settling into their daily routines. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn quiet with the kind of violence that instantly transformed a routine day into a fight for survival. Rebecca Scott was in the communications bunker when the blast wave rattled the reinforced walls and knocked coffee cups off tables 300 yards away. She ripped off her headphones and sprinted toward the surface as the base's alarm system erupted in a cacophony of sirens and automated warnings. Incoming fire, all personnel to defensive positions. The announcement repeated as she emerged from the bunker into a scene of controlled chaos. Smoke billowed from the generator complex while soldiers ran toward predetermined defensive positions, their training taking over despite the shock of the sudden assault. But this wasn't the sporadic harassment fire that forward operating base Sentinel had experienced before. This was sustained, coordinated, and coming from multiple directions simultaneously. A second RPG impacted near the motor pool, followed immediately by a third that struck the communications tower. Rebecca watched in growing horror as she realized the attacks were hitting critical infrastructure with surgical precision. This wasn't random violence, it was a carefully planned assault designed to cripple the base's ability to function and call for help. The distinctive crack of AK-47 automatic rifles began echoing from the northern perimeter, quickly joined by the deeper rhythm of PKM machine guns. Then came the sound that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Mortar. The hollow thump of tubes firing was followed by the whistle of incoming rounds that exploded across the base with devastating accuracy. She dove for cover behind a concrete barrier as shrapnel peppered the ground around her. Through the smoke and dust, she could see muzzle flashes winking from the ridgelines that surrounded the base, dozens of them, spread across multiple positions in a coordinated arc of fire that confirmed her worst intelligence assessments. Scott. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Chun, who was crouched behind the same barrier, his radio crackling with urgent communications. The talk wants all intelligence personnel to report immediately. They need threat assessments. Rebecca followed Chun toward the Tactical Operations Center, dodging between buildings as mortar rounds continued to rain down. The scene inside the talk was barely controlled pandemonium. Officers shouted orders into radios while computer screens displayed tactical maps dotted with incoming fire indicators. Lieutenant Colonel Parker stood at the center of it all, his face grim as he tried to coordinate a defense against an attack that was clearly larger and more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. "Sir," Major Williams called out, spotting Rebecca as she entered. "Scott, get over here. We need to know what we're facing." Rebecca approached the main display screen, where a tactical map showed the base surrounded by red indicators representing enemy fire positions. The scope of the attack was even worse than she'd feared. The enemy had positioned fighters in a nearly complete circle around the base, with concentrated fire coming from the high ground she'd specifically warned about. "How many do you estimate?" Parker demanded, his earlier skepticism replaced by urgent necessity. Rebecca studied the fire pattern, mentally cataloging the weapon signatures and positions she could identify from the incoming rounds. "Sir, based on the rate of fire and distribution of positions, I estimate at least 250 fighters, possibly more. They have mortar, RPGs, heavy machine guns, and coordinated command and control." Parker's face went pale. The base's garrison consisted of 180 combat-effective soldiers, and they were now facing a force that outnumbered them significantly while holding superior terrain. "How long can we hold?" he asked Williams, who was coordinating with the company commanders through his radio. Unknown, sir. They've taken out primary communications, and the backup generators are struggling to maintain power. We're effectively cut off from higher headquarters. As if to emphasize his point, another mortar barrage walked across the base, this time targeting the vehicle maintenance areas. Secondary explosions erupted as fuel and ammunition stores were hit, sending pillars of black smoke into the morning sky. Rebecca moved to one of the communication stations and began cycling through frequencies, trying to re-establish contact with the outside world. What she found was even more disturbing than the direct assault. The enemy was conducting sophisticated electronic warfare, jamming key frequencies and broadcasting false signals designed to confuse any rescue attempts. "Sir," she called out to Parker, "they're jamming our satellite communications and running deception operations on backup frequencies. This isn't just a ground assault. They're trying to prevent us from calling for air support or reinforcements." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The enemy hadn't just planned to attack the base. They'd planned to isolate it completely, ensuring that whatever happened in the next few hours would be decided solely by the forces already engaged. Captain Davis, commander of Alpha Company, burst through the Toke entrance, his uniform torn and his face blackened with smoke. "Sir, we've got serious problems on the north wall. They've concentrated at least 50 fighters there, and they're using covering fire to advance explosive charges toward the perimeter." Parker's jaw tightened. How close? Close enough that if they breach that section, they'll have direct access to the main compound. We need reinforcements on that wall, or we're going to lose the entire northern sector. But reinforcements would have to come from other defensive positions, weakening the base's ability to hold against attacks from other directions. Parker was facing the nightmare scenario that every base commander dreaded: a simultaneous multi-directional assault that forced impossible choices about resource allocation. Rebecca listened to the tactical discussions while continuing to work the communications equipment. Her predictions had been proven devastatingly accurate, but there was no satisfaction in being right about something this catastrophic. Her fellow soldiers were dying, and the base was fighting for its survival against odds that seemed insurmountable. "Sir," she said, interrupting a heated discussion about troop repositioning, "I might be able to re-establish communications with higher headquarters." Every head in the Toke turned toward her. Williams looked skeptical. "How?" "The primary systems are down, and the backup frequencies are jammed. The enemy jamming is sophisticated, but it's not perfect. They're using a rotating frequency pattern that I've been tracking. If I can time our transmissions to coincide with their rotation cycles, we might be able to get a message through." Parker didn't hesitate. "Do it. We need air support, and we need it now." Rebecca moved to the high-frequency radio set, the most powerful communication system remaining operational in the Toke. She began adjusting frequencies and power settings, using her knowledge of the enemy's electronic warfare patterns to find gaps in their jamming coverage. The work required intense concentration despite the chaos around her. Mortar continued to impact nearby, rattling the bunker and causing lights to flicker. Radio chatter filled the air as company commanders reported casualties, ammunition shortages, and deteriorating defensive positions. After 20 minutes of careful frequency management, Rebecca achieved contact with Bagram Airfield, the main coalition hub 150 kilometers to the south. "Bagram Control, this is Sentinel Base. Emergency traffic over." The response came through heavy static but was audible. "Sentinel Base, this is Bagram Control. We've been trying to reach you for 30 minutes. What is your status?" Parker took the microphone from Rebecca. "Bagram Control, Sentinel Base is under sustained attack by approximately 250 enemy fighters. We have casualties, critical infrastructure damage, and are in immediate need of close air support. Request immediate dispatch of all available aircraft." There was a pause before Bagram responded. "Sentinel Base, understand large-scale attack in progress." Be advised, weather conditions are marginal for air operations. We have limited aircraft available due to ongoing operations in other sectors. The words hit the toque like cold water. Even with communications re-established, help might not be available when they needed it most. Sir, Sergeant First Class Anderson's voice crackled over the internal radio network. Enemy forces are massing for what looks like a final assault on multiple sectors. They're bringing up heavy weapons, and we're running low on ammunition in several positions. Parker looked around the toque at his staff, his expression reflecting the weight of command in an impossible situation. The base was surrounded, outgunned, and potentially cut off from effective air support. His soldiers were fighting heroically, but heroism alone wouldn't be enough against the force arrayed against them. Rebecca continued monitoring the communication frequencies, listening to the enemy coordination efforts that had become even more sophisticated as the battle developed. What she heard made her blood run cold. The attackers were preparing for a synchronized final assault that would hit every defensive position simultaneously, overwhelming the base's ability to respond effectively. In less than an hour, forward operating Base Sentinel would face its ultimate test. The soldiers who had dismissed Rebecca Scott as unlucky were about to discover whether her technical skills and analytical abilities could provide the edge they desperately needed to survive the largest attack in the base's history. The storm she had predicted had arrived with devastating force. Now, as the base fought for its life against overwhelming odds, the question was whether the soldier they called Jinx would finally prove to be their salvation or their downfall. The enemy's final assault began with a thunderous barrage that shook the very foundations of forward operating Base Sentinel. Rebecca crouched in the Tactical Operations Center as the reinforced concrete walls vibrated under the impact of mortar, RPGs, and recoilless rifle rounds that struck with methodical precision. Through the tactical displays, she watched red indicators multiply across the screen as enemy forces advanced on all four sides of the base simultaneously. All sectors report enemy breakthrough attempts. Captain Davis's voice crackled over the radio, strained with exhaustion and urgency. North Wall has multiple breaches. We're falling back to secondary positions. Lieutenant Colonel Parker's face was grim as he surveyed the tactical situation. His garrison of 180 soldiers was now facing confirmed enemy strength of over 300 fighters who had spent months planning this assault. Ammunition was running critically low, casualties were mounting, and the sophisticated enemy coordination was preventing any effective counterattack. "Sir," Major Williams called out from the communication station. "Bagram reports 2 Apache gunships en route, but ETA is 45 minutes due to weather delays. They also have a 10 close air support available, but the ceiling is too low for effective gun runs. 45 minutes might as well have been 45 hours. At the current rate of enemy advance, the base perimeter would be completely overrun within 20 minutes. Parker's expression reflected the mathematics of the situation. They were out of time, out of options, and facing an enemy that had planned for every contingency. Rebecca continued monitoring enemy communications, her headphones filled with Taliban commanders coordinating the final phase of their assault. What she heard made her realize that the attack was even more sophisticated than anyone had understood. "Thunder 7 to all units," came the voice of the apparent enemy commander, speaking in rapid Pashto. "Begin the shepherd's dance. Drive the sheep toward the center pen. No survivors, no prisoners." The translation sent a chill through Rebecca's spine. The enemy wasn't just trying to overrun the base. They were implementing a deliberate massacre designed to eliminate every American soldier on the compound. This wasn't a tactical victory they were after. It was a propaganda triumph that would demonstrate Taliban capability to destroy an entire U.S. military installation. She switched frequencies and immediately intercepted another transmission that made the situation even worse. "Eagle Nest confirms the nest is sealed. No birds will escape to warn the others. Rebecca's hands moved frantically across her equipment as she traced the signal source. The enemy had positioned blocking forces on all the evacuation routes from the base, ensuring that even if some soldiers survived the initial assault, none would escape to report what had happened. This was designed to be a complete annihilation. "Sir," she called out to Parker, pulling off her headphones. "The enemy has blocking positions on all exfiltration routes. They're not just attacking the base, they're ensuring total destruction. No survivors, no witnesses." The weight of her words settled over the Toque like smoke. This wasn't just a military defeat they were facing. It was potential extinction for everyone on the base. "Sergeant," First Class Anderson's voice cut through the radio chatter. "TOC, this is Anderson. North perimeter is completely compromised. Enemy forces are advancing through the vehicle maintenance area. We need immediate support, or we're going to lose the entire northern sector." Parker grabbed the microphone. "Anderson, what do you need?" "Sir, we need someone who can operate the base's defensive systems from the secondary control bunker. Primary systems were taken out in the first wave, but the backups might still be functional. Problem is, the control bunker is in the middle of the firefight." Rebecca looked up from her communication equipment. She knew exactly what Anderson was referring to. The base's integrated defensive system included remotely operated machine gun positions, automated mortar systems, and coordinated spotlights that could be controlled from a hardened bunker near the north wall. The systems had been installed 6 months earlier, but required specialized training to operate effectively. "Sir," she said to Parker, "I'm qualified on the integrated defensive systems. I completed the advanced training course during my last assignment." Parker stared at her. "Scott, that bunker is in the middle of a war zone. The enemy has overrun the area around it." "Yes, sir. But those defensive systems could provide the firepower needed to break up their assault formations. Someone has to get there and activate them." Major Williams shook his head. "Even if you could reach the bunker, you'd be cut off from support. It's a suicide mission." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Sir, with respect, we're all facing a suicide mission right now. At least this way, we might take enough of them with us to matter." The brutal honesty of her assessment silenced the talk. Everyone present understood the mathematics of their situation. They were going to die unless something dramatic changed the tactical balance. The integrated defensive systems represented their only chance of inflicting enough casualties to disrupt the enemy's assault. "How long would you need to activate the systems?" Parker asked. 15 minutes to bring everything online, assuming the equipment wasn't damaged in the bombardment. Once active, I can coordinate defensive fires across the entire perimeter." Anderson's voice crackled over the radio again. "TOC, enemy forces are advancing on the command bunker. If we lose that position, they'll have direct fire control over the entire base. We need those defensive systems now." Parker looked around the Toque at his staff, all of whom understood what he was contemplating. Sending Rebecca to the defensive control bunker was essentially ordering her to her death, but it might be the only action that could save everyone else. "Scott," he said finally, "if you can reach that bunker and activate those systems, you might give us the edge we need to hold until air support arrives." Rebecca was already moving toward the equipment locker where combat gear was stored. "Sir, I'll need covering fire to reach the bunker, and someone to maintain communications once I'm there." "I'll coordinate the covering fire," Anderson's voice came through the radio. "I can see the bunker from my position. Give me 5 minutes to set up supporting fires." Rebecca strapped on body armor and checked her rifle, the familiar weight of combat equipment, focusing her mind on the task ahead. Around her, the Toque staff watched with expressions that mixed admiration, disbelief, and resignation. The soldier they had dismissed as unlucky was about to attempt something that would either save them all or confirm their worst fears about her reputation. "Scott," Parker said as she prepared to leave, For what it's worth, your intelligence analysis was that accurate. If we'd listened to your warnings—" "Sir," Rebecca interrupted, "we can discuss lessons learned after we survive this. Right now, I need to get to that bunker." She moved toward the talk exit, but Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, the base's senior communications specialist, caught her arm. "Scott, take this," he said, handing her a specialized radio headset. "It's hardened against jamming and has direct frequency access to all defensive systems. If you can get those weapons online, this will let you coordinate them effectively." Rebecca nodded her thanks and stepped out of the talk into a hellscape of smoke, explosions, and automatic weapons fire. The enemy assault had transformed the once orderly base into a chaotic battlefield where death lurked behind every corner and survival depended on speed, training, and more than a little luck. The defensive control bunker was 300 yards away, across open ground that was swept by enemy fire from multiple directions. Between her current position and her destination lay burning vehicles, scattered equipment, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen defending positions that could no longer be held. Rebecca took a deep breath, checked her equipment one final time, and prepared to make the most important run of her military career. In her headphones, she could hear Anderson coordinating covering fire with the remaining defenders. The plan was simple: create enough suppressive fire to give her a chance to reach the bunker alive. "Scott, this is Anderson. On my mark, we'll give you 30 seconds of maximum suppression. After that, you're on your own until you reach the bunker. Copy, Anderson. Standing by." She crouched at the edge of the TOC, muscles tensed for the sprint that would either save forward operating base, Sentinel, or confirm that some reputations are earned through circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Mark!" Anderson's voice cracked through her headphones. Rebecca Scott, the soldier they called Unlucky, burst from cover and began running toward a destiny that would prove whether bad luck could sometimes become the most valuable asset of all. The covering fire erupted like a thunderstorm, with every remaining American position, unleashing maximum suppression toward the enemy fighters who had infiltrated the base perimeter. Rebecca burst from the protection of the TOC entrance as tracers streaked overhead and explosions bloomed across the compound. The defensive control bunker loomed 300 yards away, distance that might as well have been 3 miles given the intensity of crossfire that swept the open ground between her current position and her destination. She sprinted in zigzag pattern, using every piece of cover available while bullets cracked past her head with a distinctive snap that meant they were close enough to kill. A mortar round exploded 20 yards to her left, showering her with concrete fragments and momentarily deafening her. She stumbled but kept running, driven by the knowledge that every second counted and that the covering fire couldn't last much longer. Halfway to the bunker, she dove behind a burned-out Humvee as a burst of PKM machine gun fire stitched across the ground where she'd been running. The heavy bullets punched through the vehicle's armor like paper, forcing her to crawl underneath the chassis for better protection. From this position, she could see enemy muzzle flashes coming from positions that should have been cleared by American forces hours ago. "Scott, this is Anderson," her radio crackled. "Enemy squad moving to intercept you from the motor pool. Adjust your route south and use the maintenance shed for cover." Rebecca acknowledged and low-crawled from beneath the Humvee, using the vehicle's bulk to shield her movement toward the suggested route. The maintenance shed was 100 yards away, but it would provide a more protected approach to the bunker. As she moved, she could hear the distinctive sound of the covering fire beginning to slacken. The defenders were running low on ammunition and couldn't maintain maximum suppression much longer. She reached the maintenance shed just as a rocket-propelled grenade struck the building's north wall, blowing a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The explosion knocked her flat and filled the air with choking dust and debris. For a moment, she lay stunned, her ears ringing and her vision blurred by the blast effects. "Scott, report status." Anderson's voice seemed to come from very far away. She keyed her radio with shaking hands. "Still mobile, continuing to objective." The final 100 yards to the bunker required crossing completely open ground with no cover except speed, and the hope that the enemy fighters were more focused on the main defensive positions than on one running soldier. Rebecca gathered herself for the final sprint, knowing that this was the moment when her reputation for bad luck would either be confirmed or shattered forever. She broke from the shelter of the damaged building and ran harder than she'd ever run in her life. The bunker's entrance was visible now, a steel door set into a concrete structure that had been designed to withstand direct mortar hits. Behind her, she could hear shouts in Pashto as enemy fighters spotted her movement and redirected their fire. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she closed the final 50 yards. A sniper's round missed her head by inches, close enough that she felt the pressure wave. 20 yards from the bunker, an RPG streaked past her shoulder and exploded against the concrete wall, showering her with fragments that tore through her uniform but missed anything vital. She reached the bunker door and found it locked with an electronic keypad that required a security code. For a terrifying moment, she thought the mission would fail at the last second because she couldn't remember the access code. Then her training kicked in, and she recalled the 8-digit sequence that had been drilled into every soldier qualified on the defensive systems. The door clicked open, and she dove inside as automatic weapons fire peppered the entrance behind her. The bunker was dark except for the dim glow of emergency lighting, and it took her eyes several seconds to adjust to the reduced visibility. When they did, her heart sank. The main control console had been damaged by the bombardment, with several display screens dark and cables hanging loose from their connections. Backup power was functioning, but at least half of the integrated defensive systems appeared to be offline. The sophisticated weapons array that was supposed to turn the tide of battle looked more like an expensive collection of broken equipment. Rebecca forced herself to think systematically despite the chaos raging outside. She had 15 minutes of specialized training on these systems, and now that training was the only thing standing between the base's survival and complete annihilation. She began checking each system individually, using diagnostic procedures that she hoped would identify which weapons were still functional. The primary machine gun positions came online first. 4 remotely operated M240 machine guns positioned at key points around the perimeter. She activated their targeting systems and immediately had visual contact with enemy fighters who were advancing through the northern sector. The weapons were functional, but she needed more than machine guns. To break up a coordinated assault by 300 fighters, the mortar system proved more challenging. The automated 120mm mortar were designed to provide precision fire support, but their targeting computers had been damaged in the bombardment. Rebecca found herself manually calculating firing solutions using techniques she'd learned in artillery school years earlier. It was time-consuming work that required absolute precision. A single miscalculation could result in rounds landing on American positions instead of enemy formations. "Talk, this is Scott," she radioed to the command center. "I have partial systems online. Need target priorities for immediate engagement." Major Williams' voice came back immediately. "Scott, enemy assault teams are massing in the northern vehicle park for final breakthrough attempt. Secondary concentration in the eastern supply area. Priority target is the command group approximately 200 meters north of the main gate." Rebecca adjusted the targeting systems and began engaging enemy positions with methodical precision. The machine guns raked the northern vehicle park, forcing enemy fighters to seek cover and disrupting their assault formation. She followed up with mortar rounds that bracketed the supply area, causing secondary explosions as enemy ammunition supplies detonated. But even as she inflicted casualties, she could see through the bunker's observation ports, that the enemy was adapting to her fires. They began moving in smaller groups, using smoke and covering fire to advance despite the defensive systems. The integrated weapons were slowing the enemy assault, but they weren't stopping it. "Scott, this is Anderson," her radio crackled. "Outstanding. Work on the northern sector, but we've got a new problem. Enemy infiltration team has reached the communications tower. If they take out our last radio link, we'll be completely cut off." Rebecca switched her targeting to the communications tower area and immediately spotted the infiltration. Team 6 fighters moving with tactical precision toward the base's most critical remaining asset. She engaged them with machine gun fire. But the range was extreme, and her effectiveness was limited by the fixed positions of the weapons. That's when she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The damaged targeting computer was displaying error messages, but buried in the diagnostic readouts was information about systems she hadn't known were available. The base's defensive array included experimental directed energy weapons that had been installed as part of a classified test program. The directed energy systems required specialized activation codes that she didn't have, but the diagnostic display showed that they could be manually activated through emergency override procedures. It was risky, the weapons were experimental and could malfunction catastrophically, but they represented firepower that could decisively change the tactical balance. As she worked to activate the experimental systems, explosions continued to rock the bunker. Enemy forces were now close enough to engage the control structure directly, and she could hear the distinctive sound of small arms fire impacting the reinforced walls. Time was running out, and her next decision would determine whether the base's defensive systems became the salvation of forward operating base Sentinel, or just another example of technology failing when it was needed most. The experimental weapons came online with a low humming sound that vibrated through the bunker's structure. Rebecca found herself controlling systems that existed at the cutting edge of military technology, weapons that could engage multiple targets simultaneously with precision that conventional firearms couldn't match. Through the targeting displays, she could see the enemy's final assault formations massing for what appeared to be their ultimate breakthrough attempt. Over 200 fighters were positioning themselves for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm the remaining American defensive positions through sheer numbers and firepower. Rebecca Scott, the soldier they called Unlucky, now controlled the most advanced defensive weapon system ever deployed in combat. In the next few minutes, she would either prove that sometimes bad luck transforms into the exact capabilities needed for survival, or she would become another casualty in a battle that had already claimed too many lives. The moment of ultimate truth had arrived, and everything depended on whether the woman who had been dismissed as a jinx could master technology sophisticated enough to change the course of the battle. The experimental directed energy weapons responded to Rebecca's commands with an eerie silence that contrasted sharply with the conventional explosions and gunfire raging outside the bunker. Through the targeting displays, she watched invisible beams of concentrated energy lance out toward enemy positions with deadly precision. Unlike bullets or explosives, these weapons left no visible trace of their passage, only the sudden collapse of enemy fighters who had been advancing with apparent invincibility. Just moments before, the first target was the Taliban command group that Major Williams had identified near the main gate. Rebecca centered the crosshairs on the cluster of fighters who were coordinating the final assault and engaged the primary directed energy system. The results were immediate and devastating. The enemy commanders simply dropped where they stood, their communications equipment sparking and failing as the directed energy disrupted both biological and electronic systems simultaneously. "Talk, this is Scott," she radioed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was unleashing. "Command. Group is neutralized. Engaging massed formations in the northern sector." She shifted her targeting to the largest concentration of enemy fighters, over 50 Taliban soldiers who had gathered in the vehicle maintenance area, for what appeared to be their final breakthrough attempt. The directed energy weapons could engage multiple targets simultaneously, and Rebecca found herself controlling firepower that seemed to belong more in a science fiction movie than on an Afghan battlefield. The enemy formation disintegrated as invisible beams swept through their ranks. Fighters who had been preparing to overrun American positions suddenly found themselves facing weapons that struck without warning, without sound, and with an effectiveness that defied their understanding of combat. Panic began to spread through the Taliban ranks as their carefully planned assault encountered technology that their tactical doctrine had never contemplated. But the experimental systems came with a price. Rebecca could see through the diagnostic displays that the weapons were consuming enormous amounts of power, and the bunker's backup generators were struggling to maintain the energy levels required for sustained operation. Warning indicators began flashing as the directed energy systems approached their thermal limits. Warning: primary capacitor temperature approaching critical threshold. The computerized voice announced through the bunker's speakers. Recommend reducing power output to prevent system failure. Rebecca faced a tactical dilemma that required split-second decision-making. She could reduce power to preserve the weapons for extended use, but lower-powered beams might not be effective against the remaining enemy forces. Alternatively, she could maintain maximum power output and risk complete system failure that would leave the base defenseless just as enemy reinforcements were arriving. Through her headphones, she heard Sergeant First Class Anderson's voice crackle with urgent intensity. "Scott, whatever you're doing with those weapons, keep it up. Enemy forces are breaking contact in multiple sectors. But we've got new problems. Reinforcement columns are approaching from the east and west. Looks like they planned for contingencies." The intelligence sent a chill through Rebecca's spine. The enemy hadn't committed all their forces to the initial assault. They had held reserves that were now converging on the base to exploit what they had expected to be a successful breakthrough. Even with the experimental weapons, she was facing an enemy that had planned for multiple phases of attack. She adjusted her targeting to engage the approaching reinforcement columns. But the range was extreme for the directed energy systems. The weapons were designed for close-range defensive operations, not long-range interdiction. She would have to wait until the enemy reinforcements closed to effective range, but by then they might have overrun positions that were already weakened by the prolonged battle. "Talk, this is Scott. Enemy reinforcements approaching from multiple directions. I can engage them when they close to approximately 800 meters, but I need to know if our defensive positions can hold until then." Lieutenant Colonel Parker's voice came back immediately. "Scott, Alpha Company reports they're down to final magazines. Bravo Company has pulled back to secondary positions. We're running on fumes here. How much longer can you maintain those weapons?" Rebecca checked the diagnostic displays and felt her heart sink. The directed energy systems were operating at 90% of thermal capacity, and the power consumption was exceeding the generator's output capability. At current usage rates, she had perhaps 10 minutes before complete system failure. "Sir, I have approximately 10 minutes of high-intensity operation remaining before system shut down. After that, we'll be back to conventional weapons only." The tactical mathematics were brutal. The experimental weapons had broken up the initial enemy assault, but the reinforcement columns contained at least another 150 fighters, who would arrive fresh and coordinated while the American defenders were exhausted and low on ammunition. 10 minutes of advanced weaponry might not be enough to secure victory. That's when Rebecca noticed something in the enemy communication intercepts that she had been monitoring through her secondary equipment. The Taliban reinforcement commanders were coordinating their approach using the same frequency patterns she had been tracking for weeks. Their radio discipline had deteriorated under the stress of unexpected resistance, and they were transmitting tactical information in clear language, rather than coded references. She realized that her dual role as both weapons operator and intelligence analyst gave her a unique advantage. While engaging targets with the directed energy systems, she could simultaneously intercept enemy communications and predict their tactical movements with unprecedented accuracy. Eagle 2 to Thunder Base. She heard through her headphones in Pashto. Western column is 15 minutes from support positions. Eastern column requests immediate assistance. Their lead elements are taking heavy casualties from unknown weapons. Rebecca translated the intercept while simultaneously engaging the eastern column with precision fires. The enemy was experiencing something they had never encountered before: real-time intelligence, being used to direct weapons that operated beyond their understanding. She could predict their movements and engage them before they even reached their intended positions. The combination of advanced weapons and superior intelligence created a tactical advantage that began to cascade through the enemy's entire operational plan. As reinforcement columns encountered devastating and inexplicable resistance, their coordination began to break down. Unit commanders started making independent decisions rather than following the centralized plan that had brought them initial success. Thunder Base to all units, came an increasingly desperate voice over the enemy communications. Unknown weapon system is targeting command elements. All units disperse and advance independently. Maintain radio silence until objective is secured. But dispersal played directly into Rebecca's hands. The directed energy weapons were most effective against concentrated targets, but her intelligence capabilities allowed her to track individual units even when they attempted to operate independently. She had become a one-person intelligence and weapons system that was systematically dismantling an enemy force that outnumbered the base's defenders by more than 2 to 1. TOC, this is Scott. Enemy forces are dispersing due to weapons effectiveness. I'm tracking individual units through communications intercept and engaging priority targets. Recommend coordinating remaining defensive fires to support my targeting. Major Williams' voice carried a note of amazement. Scott, your targeting is incredible. How are you predicting their movements so accurately? Sir, I'm intercepting their tactical communications in real time and using the intelligence to direct weapons fire. The enemy's radio discipline has collapsed under pressure, and they're broadcasting their intentions in clear language. The revelation transformed the tactical situation from desperate defense to coordinated counterattack. Rebecca continued operating the experimental weapons while providing real-time intelligence that allowed the remaining American defenders to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. Enemy forces that had seemed overwhelming just minutes earlier were now being systematically hunted by defenders who knew exactly where they were and where they were going. But the directed energy systems were approaching critical failure. Warning. Alarms filled the bunker as thermal readings climbed toward dangerous levels, and power consumption pushed the generators beyond their design limits. Rebecca faced the prospect of losing her most effective weapons just as the battle was reaching its climax. System failure imminent, the computerized voice announced. Emergency shutdown required to prevent catastrophic damage. Rebecca's hands hovered over the shutdown controls as she weighed her options. She could preserve the experimental systems for potential future use, or she could push them to complete failure while inflicting maximum damage on the remaining enemy forces. It was a decision that would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but potentially the future of advanced military technology. Through the observation ports, she could see that the enemy's coordinated assault had transformed into scattered groups of fighters who were attempting to withdraw under the pressure of weapons they couldn't understand or counter. The experimental directed energy systems had accomplished something that conventional warfare couldn't. They had broken the enemy's will to fight by demonstrating technological superiority that seemed almost supernatural. Rebecca Scott, the soldier they called unlucky, now controlled the most advanced weapons ever deployed in combat. Her next decision would determine whether those weapons became the salvation of forward, operating base sentinel or a cautionary tale about technology pushed beyond its limits when survival demanded the impossible. Rebecca's finger hovered over the emergency shutdown control as the directed energy systems approached catastrophic failure. The bunker filled with the acrid smell of overheating electronics and the high-pitched whine of capacitors pushed beyond their design limits. Through her targeting displays, she could see the remaining enemy forces, approximately 120 fighters, regrouping in the hills surrounding the base for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault. System temperature at 98% of critical threshold, the computerized warning announced. Immediate shutdown required to prevent irreversible damage. But shutting down now would leave the base vulnerable, just as the enemy was preparing their last push. Rebecca made a decision that would define her legacy. Instead of preserving the experimental technology, she would push it to complete destruction while inflicting maximum damage on the attacking forces. "Talk, this is Scott," she radioed. "I'm pushing the directed energy systems to failure. Estimate 3 minutes of maximum power operation before complete system shutdown. Recommend all defensive positions prepare for conventional engagement after." That, Lieutenant Colonel Parker's voice carried grim understanding. "Copy, Scott. We'll make those 3 minutes count." Rebecca released the safety interlocks that had been preventing the systems from operating at dangerous power levels. Immediately, the weapon's effectiveness increased dramatically. The invisible energy beams could now engage targets at extended range with lethal precision, and their rate of fire accelerated to levels that conventional weapons couldn't match. She targeted the enemy's heavy weapons positions first, the mortar and recoilless rifles that had been devastating the base's defensive structures. The directed energy systems reached out across the valley with silent lethality, and enemy weapon teams simply collapsed at their positions. Secondary explosions erupted as ammunition stores detonated under the energy bombardment. "Enemy heavy weapons neutralized," she reported, while shifting targeting to the massed infantry formations, engaging assault teams preparing for final attack. Through her communication intercepts, she heard the growing panic in enemy transmissions as their tactical situation disintegrated under the assault of weapons they couldn't understand or counter. All units," came a desperate voice in Pashto. "Unknown weapons are targeting from impossible range. Request immediate withdrawal authorization." But the enemy commander's response revealed the depth of their commitment. Negative on withdrawal. Mission must be completed. All units advance immediately. Accept martyrdom if necessary. Rebecca realized she was facing an enemy that would fight to the death regardless of casualties. The directed energy systems had disrupted their coordination and eliminated their heavy weapons, but the remaining fighters were fanatics who would continue attacking even without tactical advantage. The temperature warnings became more urgent. As the experimental systems pushed deeper into dangerous operating parameters, critical threshold exceeded. System failure imminent. Emergency shutdown in 90 seconds. Rebecca worked with desperate efficiency, targeting every enemy concentration she could identify while simultaneously coordinating with the base's conventional defenders. Her real-time intelligence allowed American positions to engage enemy forces with unprecedented accuracy, turning the surrounding hills into a killing field where Taliban fighters found themselves caught between advanced weapons they couldn't see and conventional fires directed by perfect intelligence. "Scott, this is Anderson," came the voice of the senior NCO who had supported her from the beginning. "Whatever you're doing is working. Enemy forces are breaking contact across multiple sectors. But you need to know we've got aircraft inbound. 2 Apaches and an A-10, ETA 5 minutes. The news should have been cause for celebration, but Rebecca realized it created a new problem. The incoming aircraft would be flying directly into the engagement area where her directed energy weapons were operating. The experimental systems had never been tested for electromagnetic compatibility with friendly aircraft, and there was a real possibility that the energy beams could interfere with or damage the incoming air support. TOC. Advise incoming aircraft that experimental energy weapons are active in the target area. Unknown electromagnetic effects possible. Copy, Scott. Be advised. The A-10 pilot reports he can see secondary explosions across the entire valley. Request your target priorities for gun runs. Rebecca faced a complex tactical decision. She could shut down the directed energy systems to allow safe air support operations, but that would give the remaining enemy forces an opportunity to regroup. Alternatively, she could continue operating the experimental weapons and risk interfering with the aircraft that represented the base's best hope for decisive victory. The decision was made for her when the directed energy systems finally reached their absolute limits. Warning klaxons filled the bunker as multiple subsystems failed simultaneously. The main targeting display went dark, followed by the secondary weapons console. Emergency lighting activated as the primary power system shut down to prevent catastrophic damage. System failure complete, the computerized voice announced with mechanical finality. All directed energy weapons offline. Conventional systems remain operational. Rebecca switched to the backup conventional weapons, the machine guns and mortar that had started the defensive engagement hours earlier. After operating cutting-edge experimental technology, the conventional systems felt primitive, but they were still effective against enemy forces that had been decimated by the advanced weapons. Through her observation ports, she could see the incoming Apache helicopters beginning their attack runs. The distinctive sound of 30mm chain guns filled the air as the aircraft engaged scattered enemy positions that had survived the directed energy bombardment. The A-10 followed with devastating gun runs that carved trenches through the hillsides, where Taliban fighters had taken cover. All enemy positions in the northern sector are neutralized, came the voice of the lead Apache pilot, switching to eastern sector. Scott, your target intelligence was dead accurate. We're finding exactly what you predicted, exactly where you said it would be. The combination of Rebecca's intelligence work and overwhelming air power was completing the destruction of enemy forces that had once seemed invincible. But even as victory became apparent, she realized that the most important battle was just beginning, the battle to understand and replicate the capabilities she had demonstrated under extreme conditions. Scott, this is Colonel Parker. Outstanding work. When you're ready, we need a complete debrief on those experimental systems. What you accomplished here is going to change how we think about defensive operations. Rebecca began shutting down the remaining conventional systems as the sounds of combat gradually faded. Through her headphones, she could hear enemy communications, shifting from tactical coordination to desperate evacuation requests. The carefully planned assault that had nearly succeeded was transforming into a disorganized retreat. TOC, this is Scott. All experimental systems are offline and will require complete rebuild before future operations. Conventional defensive systems remain operational, but are not needed given current tactical situation. As she prepared to leave the bunker, Rebecca reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few hours. She had entered the battle as a dismissed intelligence analyst whose warnings had been ignored. She was leaving as the operator of the most advanced weapons ever deployed in combat, having demonstrated capabilities that would reshape military thinking for years to come. But more importantly, she had proven that technical expertise and analytical thinking could overcome numerical disadvantage when applied with precision and determination. The soldier they called unlucky had become the architect of one of the most lopsided tactical victories in modern military history. Scott, this is Anderson. Ground sweep indicates approximately 280 enemy KIA with minimal friendly casualties. Whatever reputation you had before today, it's officially dead and buried. Rebecca smiled for the first time in hours as she secured the bunker's systems and prepared to rejoin her fellow soldiers. The experimental weapons had been destroyed in their first operational use, but the intelligence techniques and tactical innovations she had demonstrated would survive to protect future generations of American forces. The battle for forward operating Base Sentinel was over, but the legend of the soldier who turned bad luck into technological salvation was just beginning. Rebecca Scott had transformed from an invisible analyst into a tactical innovator whose methods would be studied and replicated across the military for decades to come. As she emerged from the bunker into the smoke-filled dawn, she could see helicopters landing to evacuate casualties and resupply the base. The crisis was over, but the recognition of her contributions was about to begin in ways that would permanently alter her military career and establish her as one of the most influential soldiers of her generation. 6 weeks after the Battle of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Rebecca Scott stood in the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, facing an audience of generals, defense contractors, and intelligence officials who represented the highest levels of American military leadership. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed detailed schematics of the experimental directed energy systems she had operated during the battle, but the real focus was on the tactical innovations she had developed under fire. The integration of real-time signals intelligence with precision weapons targeting represents a fundamental shift in how we approach defensive operations, she explained to the assembled group. By combining communications intercept with automated weapon systems, a single operator can achieve tactical effects that previously required entire units. General Patricia Morrison, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, leaned forward in her chair. Sergeant Scott, the after-action reports indicate you eliminated over 200 enemy fighters while simultaneously coordinating base defense. That's a level of individual battlefield impact we've never seen before. Rebecca nodded professionally. Ma'am, the key was recognizing that modern warfare requires operators who can function across multiple disciplines simultaneously. The enemy's sophisticated coordination became their vulnerability once we could intercept their communications and use that intelligence to direct precision fires. The transformation in how she was perceived was complete. 6 weeks earlier, she had been the soldier everyone blamed for equipment failures and operational complications. Now, she was briefing 4-star generals on tactical innovations that would reshape American military doctrine for the next generation. Colonel James Patterson, representing the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, reviewed the technical specifications on his tablet. Scott, the experimental systems you operated were destroyed during the engagement. Can you replicate your operational techniques with conventional weapons? Yes, sir. The directed energy weapons provided overwhelming firepower, but the real innovation was the integration methodology. I've developed training protocols that allow conventional weapons operators to achieve similar results using existing communications and targeting equipment. That was the question everyone had been waiting for. The experimental weapons had been prototypes worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Rebecca's tactical methods could be implemented with equipment that was already deployed across the military. Her techniques represented a force multiplier that could transform average soldiers into tactical game-changers. Dr. Sarah Chun, the lead scientist from the Directed Energy Weapons Program, studied Rebecca with obvious fascination. From an engineering perspective, you operated those systems beyond their design parameters while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The data we recovered suggests you understood the technology better than the people who built it. Rebecca's response reflected the confidence she had gained through proving herself under the ultimate test. Ma'am, I had excellent training on the systems, but more importantly, I understood that technology is only as effective as the operator's ability to adapt it to tactical requirements. When survival is at stake, you push every system to its absolute limits. Major General Robert Hayes, the commanding general of the Army's Intelligence and Security Command, addressed the broader implications of her performance. Scott, your background shows repeated incidents that were attributed to bad luck or equipment failure. In retrospect, many of those incidents appear to have been examples of you identifying problems that others missed. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that her reputation for being unlucky had been built on a foundation of organizational failure rather than personal incompetence. Rebecca had been punished for being observant, for noticing problems, and for speaking up about issues that others preferred to ignore. Sir, I've learned that what appears to be bad luck is often just reality asserting itself over wishful thinking. My role was to see problems that others missed and to prepare for contingencies that others hoped wouldn't happen. The observation carried implications that extended far beyond individual performance evaluations. Military organizations that dismissed or marginalized soldiers who identified problems were creating vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Rebecca's case had become a cautionary tale about the importance of listening to unconventional voices. General Morrison stood and walked to the presentation screen. Scott, based on your performance and the innovations you've developed, we're creating a new military occupational specialty, integrated intelligence and weapons operations. You'll be the first soldier to hold this designation, and you'll be responsible for developing training programs for the entire Army. The announcement represented more than just a promotion or career change. Rebecca was being entrusted with institutionalizing the capabilities she had demonstrated under fire, ensuring that future soldiers could replicate her tactical innovations without requiring the extreme circumstances that had forced her to develop them originally. Additionally, General Morrison continued, you're being promoted to Staff Sergeant effective immediately, with assignment to the Army's Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technologies Office. Your first mission will be to develop operational requirements for the next generation of integrated defensive systems. Rebecca accepted the promotion with the same steady professionalism she had shown throughout her military career. But internally, she marveled at the complete reversal of her circumstances. 18 months earlier, she had been separated from active duty due to budget cuts. 6 weeks ago, she had been relegated to maintenance duties because her superiors believed she was unlucky. Now she was being entrusted with shaping the future of American military technology. Sergeant First Class Anderson, who had been invited to attend the briefing as one of the few witnesses to Rebecca's complete transformation, stood to address the group. If I may, sir, I think there's an important lesson here about how we evaluate personnel. Scott was always exceptional, we just weren't smart enough to recognize it. His comment generated uncomfortable silence among the senior officers present. The implication was clear. If Rebecca Scott had been overlooked and underutilized, how? Many other exceptional soldiers were being wasted due to institutional blindness or bureaucratic incompetence. Dr. Chun broke the silence with a technical question that redirected the discussion toward future applications. Scott, given unlimited resources and development time, how would you design the next generation of integrated defensive systems? Rebecca had been thinking about that question for weeks, ever since the experimental weapons had been destroyed at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Her answer reflected both technical expertise and hard-won tactical wisdom. Ma'am, the focus should be on adaptability rather than raw power. The experimental systems were incredibly effective, but they were also inflexible and fragile. Future systems need to be robust enough to function after taking damage, simple enough to be operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training, and sophisticated enough to integrate with existing communications and intelligence networks. She moved to the presentation screen and began sketching a conceptual diagram. The key is creating modular systems that can be rapidly deployed and configured for specific tactical situations. Instead of building single-purpose weapons, we should develop platforms that can function as communications nodes, intelligence collection systems, and weapons controllers simultaneously. The concept she was describing represented a fundamental shift from the traditional model of specialized military equipment toward integrated systems that could perform multiple functions. It was an approach that reflected her own evolution from specialized intelligence analyst to multidisciplinary tactical operator. General Hayes nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. Scott, your first assignment will be to establish a test unit that can evaluate and refine these concepts under field conditions. As the briefing concluded and the senior officials began filing out of the room, Rebecca found herself alone with Anderson, the NCO who had supported her when everyone else was treating her as a liability. "Well, Scott, looks like your luck finally changed," he said with a grin. Rebecca shook her head. "Anderson, I don't think it was ever about luck. I think it was about being in situations where conventional thinking wasn't enough, and having the training and determination to find unconventional solutions." The observation captured the essence of her transformation. She hadn't become lucky, she had revealed capabilities that had always existed, but had never been properly recognized or utilized. The soldier they called Jinx had always possessed the skills needed to excel. She had simply never been placed in circumstances where those skills could be demonstrated decisively. As she walked through the Pentagon's corridors toward her new assignment, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed contractor to military innovator. The reputation for bad luck that had nearly ended her career had ultimately become the catalyst for innovations that would influence military operations for decades to come. Her story would be studied in military academies as an example of how institutional biases could blind organizations to the capabilities of their own personnel. More importantly, her tactical innovations would save lives by giving future soldiers the tools and techniques needed to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The soldier they called unlucky had become proof that sometimes the people an organization dismisses as problems are actually the solutions they desperately need. Rebecca Scott's legacy would extend far beyond her individual achievements to influence how the military identified, developed, and utilized the talents of soldiers who didn't fit conventional expectations. She was no longer the Jinx who brought bad luck to every operation. She was Staff Sergeant Rebecca Scott, military innovator, whose unconventional path to recognition had revealed truths about leadership, technology, and human potential that would reshape American military thinking for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.